Obviously, to people in the manosphere, the idea or the concept of hypergamy is nothing new. In fact, it was the manosphere, and specifically MGTOW, that probably first made abundant use and description of this term. But times change, and the perception of certain things change as well, meaning that as words grow in currency and more people become aware of them, the perception of these things tends to take on different tones and different meanings. So at the outset, I want to talk about just what it is. What is hypergamy? Because given how ubiquitous this term has become, I think a lot of confusion has emerged as to what it is. What it is and, of course, what it's not. One common error I see, especially, unfortunately, in the manosphere, is describing any sort of negative behavior associated with women as being hypergamous. So, for example, a woman behaves in a particularly atrocious way, unethically, cruelly, or just irresponsibly. I've seen this time and again be described as hypergamous. Hypergamy is a very specific term, and it means something very particular. That is the tendency to marry or mate upwards, specifically in women. That's what it means, and derived from the Greek hyper, up or over, and from the other Greek word gamia, meaning the act of union or the act of marrying. So that's really what it means. Everything apart from that is separate, although it can, of course, be related. Now, I don't think this is just a tendency, because a tendency would be too weak an interpretation of what hypergamy actually is. It's an overwhelming tendency. It is universally observable across the globe, and more importantly, historically and prehistorically, it's universally observable in the sense that we can even read it in our genomic record. So it's very much a thing, and there's a lot of conflation. So we don't want to conflate what it is and what it is not. It is unfortunate even in the manosphere, particularly in the manosphere, this happens. But the crux of this video is that this word has become much more mainstream. Are they talking about left and right? No. But as I mentioned in the previous video, alluding to Sargon, it has become an acceptable term in certain circles, and even somewhat in the mainstream. Jordan Peterson, for example, has referred to it on occasion. He's talked about certain tendencies and the differences between the sexes. But what interests me here is the reception by what we might typically refer to as normies. There is definitely a general acknowledgement that hypergamy is a thing. Few people are in denial. Back in the day, people say all sorts of things. For example, that men are hypergamous too. And no, that's another conflating factor. Men are not hypergamous. Men marry down all the time. That's not what hypergamy is. Yes, men prefer youthful, attractive women, but a man is perfectly willing to pick up a girlfriend who's working as a waitress, who has no prospects otherwise, and marry her. In fact, a very good example of this is the world-famous strongman Hafthor Bjornsson from Iceland, who picked up a Canadian waitress, and they're married, or they're going to have kids now. This happens all the time. The reverse simply does not occur. You don't get women going to restaurants and diners picking up waiters as future husband prospects. It just doesn't work that way. So no, men are not hypergamous. They have their own mechanisms and their own methods, but that's not hypergamy. It's not marrying or mating upwards. Men are not interested in that. So no, that's not the same thing. But you still hear these things. And we should also be clear that in terms of evolutionary behavior, things are just what they are. I don't personally view hypergamy as good or bad. It's simply a reproductive methodology, if you wish to call it that evolved in our species, and specifically in the females of our species. And there are good reasons for this, because obviously it ensured maximal fitness for the women participating in it, which is why it's such a ubiquitous behavior in women today. You see it everywhere, because that's what was the most beneficial as far as a reproductive model. And of course there are things, and I coined this term, runaway hypergamy, years ago, that are made manifest in the modern world that can very much reflect a maladaptive feature of a certain behavior. So it's all well and good to want to mate upwards in a small group of several dozen individuals, but what kind of interference is run when you're living in a world that's interconnected by the millions, if not billions, and there's so much choice, the illusion of choice, available? You run into some serious problems, which is what we're witnessing now. But inasmuch as this has become more mainstream, one thing we certainly can observe is the fact that it is somehow men's fault that runaway hypergamy and the causes of it, basically modernity, the internet, and when we do hear about the mainstream talking about it, some of these articles, for example, you'll hear things along the lines of, it's basically men's fault that they're too poor. Women can't find suitable partners because men aren't earning enough. Never once taking into consideration that a trait can be adaptive in one setting and maladaptive in another. Again, if you're living in a tribe of some 30 individuals, okay, there's a limited mate pool. You can select the top mate there. You're going to optimize, at least in theory, your outcome. How are you supposed to do that in a world with, again, millions, if not in an interconnected sense, billions of people? And then we have this concurrent phenomenon of women increasingly earning money online simply by existing, which circumvents all sorts of things. Status is a kind of nebulous term. Women are interested in status. Traditionally, yes, status has been associated with resources and money. But in the hyper-real world we live in, status arguably is just as much associated with looks, for example. That if you are a prominent online personality who's very attractive as a male, that can be seen as a move upwards in status, for example, not just the financial aspects. So there are a lot of conflating factors here. And somehow, it's always the case that men are to be blamed here. It's not observed, for example, that in a situation such as our current one, this weird post-modern construct we call the current year, that you're going to experience what I would like to consider a Y-chromosomal bottleneck of a sort. I made a video years ago titled Neolithic Hypergamy. And in that video, I speak at some length about a population bottleneck that occurred to the Y chromosomes, to the male lineages, for a significant amount of time across the globe, everywhere where there was agriculture. And it was observed that women, essentially en masse, moved away from hunter-gatherers to the farmers, who had a more sedentary, safer, agrarian, and therefore richer lifestyle, more reliable lifestyle. And this was reflected in the genome, because for a significant period of time, for every 17 women, one man reproduced. This is during the agricultural revolution. So we know this exists. We know it's real. And these sorts of bottlenecks occur all the time. Now, the difference is, say, compared to back then, if you're actually a 5 or a 6 as a woman, and you think, through some psychological deceit, that you deserve a 9 or a 10, it's very unlikely you're able to get that. You might be able to have sex with that person, but long-term partnership, almost certainly not. And so clearly it was an option for these Neolithic hunter-gatherer women to move in and shack up with farmers, but the same can't be said of the huge swaths of average women who think that they deserve 9s and 10s and perfect men. That is a pipe dream. And so they date incessantly and repeatedly throughout their prime years, finding nothing, and finally settle, and they're dissatisfied, which probably is one of the reasons why divorce rates are so high. Just a suggestion. And you end up with a situation. But it somehow, of course, is men's fault. So I guess the point to drive home here is that even as terms become mainstream and are accepted, for example, that women almost universally seek higher status males, and define status as you will, it is variable. But once you have a situation of runaway hypergamy, as we do right now, where every average woman thinks she deserves the head honcho, where the head honcho is basically only presented on a screen and is unattainable. And it reminds me of that cartoon of Lois Lane, who's copulated with Superman, wondering if she's actually done the best that she can. Well, end up in a difficult situation, but men repeatedly are to blame somehow. Because here's the thing, the mean is shifting. An average guy no longer has the same success with women that he used to. That much is clear. But that's not his fault. This is just a reflection of social, societal, and indeed biological trends. And I think we need to be aware of this, that ideas as they actually are will never be embraced by the mainstream. Because in this case, if it puts a negative slant on a particular behavior, and again, Hypergamy by itself is just an adaptive behavior in a particular setting that has become somewhat maladaptive in the post-postmodern world. Well, what can you expect to happen? Of course, it's going to be men to blame. It's always like that. Which is why I have the conviction that nothing that's ever been talked about in the manosphere will ever really make it to the mainstream. Because that would imply concern for men as human beings. That would imply an awareness of these things. That would imply that it's entirely possible to have an adaptive behavior historically and prehistorically that has become maladaptive, that doesn't work anymore because women aren't particularly happy to their perpetual dissatisfaction. Somehow men are responsible for this. Essentially, huge swaths of men, enormous numbers of men have become functionally invisible, and it's their fault, although nobody sees them. Think about how oxymoronic and insane that is. They're invisible, but you're blaming them even though you don't see them. So I'm not hopeful about any terminology or any concept that has been interpreted and coined, I think, accurately in a manosphere context to receive its proper due in the mainstream. As I said, in recent years, it's been acknowledged that women are having trouble finding partners, and of course it's the men's fault, although the men that are causing them problems are not men that they look at in the first place because they're invisible. It's insane. In any event, gentlemen, terms shift in their perception. I wanted to clear some things up as to what hypergamy is and what it is not. Sometimes these refreshers are good. And we always need to bear in mind that the mainstream, and even the peripheral mainstream, will never, ever accept some of these ideas, even if they're fantastically accurate. Gentlemen, as always, if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later, and may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.